All right, mic check, mic check. Too loud. Yo, where's my snare? DJ, fucking where's my snare drum in my headphone? You son of a bitch, you DJ. Turn my damn head up, 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 up. Ding dong. Let me just make a little posty post. Ready to go. Okay. Here, I'm gonna do one of these. Let me fade. Okay. Hey everyone. Let's pick up where we left off last night. All right, so I'm going to open our PDF here. And let's start at the section called Legitimating versus Meaningless Third World Elections. In Chapter 3, we show that the mainstream media have followed a government agenda in treating elections in client and disfavored states. In El Salvador in the 1980s, this is what I'm reading right here. The U.S. government sponsored several elections to demonstrate to the U.S. public that our intervention there was approved by the local population. Whereas when Nicaragua held an election in 1984, the Reagan administration tried to discredit it to prevent legitimation of a government the administration was trying to overthrow. The mainstream media cooperated, funding the finding the Salvadorian election a step towards democracy and the Nicaraguan election a sham, despite the fact that electoral conditions were far more compatible with an honest election in Nicaragua than in El Salvador. We demonstrate that the media applied a remarkable dual standard to the two elections in accord with the government's propaganda needs. The same bias is apparent in the press treatment of more recent elections in Cambodia, Yugoslavia, Kenya, Mexico, Russia, Turkey, and Uruguay. Sorry, let me. Uruguay, Cambodia, and Yugoslavia were the only two of these seven ruled by a party strongly objectionable to U.S. policymakers, and it is in these cases that the New York Times warned of serious problems. As regards Cambodia, it asserted that flawed elections are worse than none, and that the international community must proceed cautiously, lest a rigged election give Mr. Hun Sen a veneer of legitimacy. In reporting on the Yugoslavian election of September 2000, in which U.S. officials intervened openly to prevent the re election of Slobodan Milosevic, the Times and media in general repeatedly warned of the possibility of fraud and a rigged election. In the case of Kenya, where U.S. policy towards the ruling government was ambivalent, here also the Times was skeptical of election quality, noting that holding elections is not enough to ensure democratic government, and stressing the need for an independent electoral commission less bound to political parties and independent broadcast media, allowing opposition voices to be heard outside election periods. But in the other four elections, organized and won by governments strongly favored by the U.S. State Department, there were no suggestions that flawed elections are worse than none, and no featuring of the threat of fraud, the importance of an independent electoral commission, and broadcast media was not pressed, and in each case the election was found to be a step towards democracy, and hence legitimizing. In the case of Mexico, long subject to one party, PRJ rule, but supported by the US government over the past several decades, the Times has regularly found the Mexican elections encouraging, in contrast with past fraudulent ones, which, at the time, the editors also contrasted favorably with those in the more distant past. It has featured expressions of benevolent intent and downplayed structural defects and abuses. Thus, in its first editorial on the 1988 election that brought Carlos Salinas de Gortari power, the Times noted that prior elections were corrupt. The PRI manipulated patronage, the news media, and the ballot box, but it suggested that PRI candidate Salinas commends that political reform is urgent and calls for clean elections. The editors questioned whether his party will heed his pleas, a process of distancing the favored candidate from responsibility. Excuse me. Process of distancing the favored candidate from responsibility for any abuses to come. In the editorials that followed, the Times did not suggest possible ongoing electoral fraud, manipulated patronage, or media controls and bias, although this election was famous for a convenient computer breakdown in the election aftermath, which turned Carlos Salinas from an expected loser into a winner. Just 3 years later, however, at the time of the 1991 election, the editors stated that as long as anyone can remember, Mexican elections have been massively fraudulent. As it prepares readers for new promises of a cleanup, But all through this period and later, the Times and its media rivals did not focus on fraud or call these elections rigged. In both news stories and editorials, they portrayed these deeply flawed elections as steps towards democracy and legitimizing. In the 1983 Turkish election, held under military rule, with harsh censorship and only three parties led by politicians sympathetic to the military government allowed to run, the Times found that Turkey approaches democracy. Similarly, in Uruguay's 1984 election, under another military regime that jailed the leading opposition candidate and also refused to allow a second major candidate to run, but organized by a government approved by the U.S. State Department, the Times once again found that Uruguay is resuming its democratic vocation. The generals are yielding to the infectious resurgence of democracy in much of Latin America. The Russian election of 1996 was important to the United States and its allies, as Boris Yeltsin, the ruler who was carrying out their favored policies of privatization and the integration of Russia into the global financial system, was seriously threatened with defeat. Yeah, let me test my chat. Let's see if this works. What does that say right there on my chat there? Chat disconnected. Please try again later. What does that mean? Hmm. Chat disconnected. Why is that? Oh, is it because? How to fix this? 1 second, real quick. Where is me chat? Sorry about this. Let me put on some music actually while we wait. What am I trying to do here? Damn it. Here's what I want. I want to grab the chat over here. And then bring that back into the Okay, now we're good. Thank you. I'm gonna cut that. Jamie, cut that. Anyway. Boris Yeltsin, the ruler who was carrying out their favorite policies of privatization and the integration of Russia into the global financial system, was seriously threatened with defeat. The Yeltsin government had presided over a 50% fall in national output and large income declines for 90% of the population, while the hugely corrupt privatization process provided windfalls to a small minority, including an important criminal class. The social welfare and health care systems had disintegrated under Yeltsin's rule, contributing to a startling rise in infectious diseases and mortality rates. Just before the 1996 election campaign, Yeltsin's popularity rating was 8%. That he could win re election in such circumstances suggests and reflects a seriously flawed election. However, with the Yeltsin regime strongly backed by the US government and its Western allies, the New York Times once again found this election a victory for Russian democracy, and so did the US mainstream media in general. For that paper of record, electoral flaws were slighted or ignored, and its editors declared the very fact of holding an imperfect election a remarkable achievement. The same bias was evident in reporting on the March 2000 Russian election, won by Yeltsin's anointed heir and former KGB operative Vladimir Putin. Putin had built his popularity by conducting a brutal counterinsurgency war against Chechnya, and his electoral success rested heavily on the fact that the powerful state TV and radio stations campaigned furiously on his behalf and denigrated and gave no broadcasting time to his opponents. A September 2000 expose of the Putin election campaign by the expatriate Moscow Times, based on a 6-month investigative effort, uncovered compelling evidence of election fraud, including ballot stuffing, ballot destruction, and the creation of 1.3 million dead souls inflating the election rolls. The U.S. mainstream media, however, never found any evidence of fraud at the time of the election, and they have been reluctant to report the findings of the Moscow Times study. Putin is another reformer like Yeltsin, supported by the West, so that it follows once again that for the mainstream media, a flawed election, hardly admitted to be flawed, remains better than none. The KGB Bulgarian plot to assassinate the Pope. Oh boy. During the during the Reagan era, 1981 to 1888, there was a concerted effort to demonize the Soviet Union in order to support a major arms buildup and a new, more aggressive policy in the Third World and globally. The Soviet Union was described as an evil empire and accused of sponsoring international terrorism as well as abusing its own and client nation peoples. When the would-be assassin Mehmet Ali Agca shot Pope John Paul II in Rome in 1981, this provided the basis for one of the most successful propaganda campaigns of the Cold War era. Although the Pope's assailant was a Turkish fascist and member of a violently anti-left party in Turkey, after a 17-month stint in an Italian prison, Agca confessed that he had been hired by the KGB and Bulgarians. Confessed in quotes. The confession was convenient, fitting well with the interests of the dominant Italian parties anxious to discredit the powerful Italian Communist Party, as well as the Reagan administration's evil empire campaign. It was extremely suspicious for other reasons, coming so blatant, coming so belatedly, and after numerous visits to Acca by Italian Secret Service representatives, judges, and papal agents, all with a political axe to grind, and with the Secret Service notorious for ideological extremism and willingness to doctor evidence. But the mainstream media accepted this story with astonishing gullibility. The possibility of coaching and pressure on Akka to name the KGB and Bulgarians, much discussed in the Italian media, was almost never mentioned as even a theoretical possibility. And the weakness of the alleged Soviet motive, the sheer stupidity of the enterprise if Soviet-based, and the complete lack of confirmatory evidence was almost entirely ignored by the media, as described in Chapter 4. When the case was lost in Italian court in 1986, despite a substantial Italian government investment and effort for the U.S. mainstream media, this merely reflected the peculiarities of the Italian system of justice. The continued absence of hard evidence led to no reassessment of the case or reflections on on their own role. In the years that followed, two developments threw some light on the case. One is that the Soviet and Bulgarian archives were opened up, and Alan Weinstein of the Center for Democracy Bulgarian authorities, gained permission from Bulgaria. What happened? In 1991, for members of his investigative commission to look at the Bulgarian Interior Ministry's Secret Service files. After a stint in Bulgaria, Weinstein returned home having failed to locate any confirmatory evidence of Bulgarian or KGB involvement. The Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, Washington Post, Newsweek, and Time, each of which had reported Weinstein's initiative and impending trip to Bulgaria in 1991, all failed to inform their readers of his negative findings. Later in 1991, at Senate hearings on the confirmation of Robert Gates as head of the CIA, former CIA officers Melvin Goodman and Harold Ford testified that the CIA's analysis of the Bulgarian connection had been seriously compromised and politicized in support of the Reagan era anti-Soviet propaganda campaign. Goodman testified that not only had the CIA found no evidence of Soviet or Bulgarian involvement in the shooting, but that based on the CIA's very good penetration of the Bulgarian secret services, its professionals had concluded that a Bulgarian connection did not exist. This testimony, which was a brutal coup de grace to the claims of a connection, put the media on the spot. It was now clear in their enthusiastic support of the plot they had seriously misled their viewers and performed badly as news purveyors and analysts, although serving well the propaganda needs of their government. But, as in 1986, after the case against the Bulgarians was dismissed in an Italian court for insufficient evidence, none of them felt any obligation to explain their failures and apologize to their readers. They reported the CIA revelations tersely, with some still claiming that while the connection had not been proved, it had not been disproved either, ignoring the frequent impossibility of proving a negative. But in general, the mainstream media moved quickly on without reassessing their performance or the fact that they and their media colleagues had been agents of propaganda. The New York Times, which had been consistently supportive of the connection in both news and editorials, not only failed to report Weinstein's negative findings from the search of the Bulgarian files, it also excluded Goodman's statement on the CIA's penetration of the Bulgarian secret services from their excerpts from this testimony. The Times had long maintained that the CIA and Reagan administration recoiled from the devastating implication that Bulgaria's agents were bound to have acted only on a signal from Moscow. But Goodman and Ford's testimony showed that this was the reverse of the truth, and that CIA head William Casey and Robert Gates overrode the views of CIA professionals and falsified evidence to support a Soviet linkage. The Times oh wow. I don't think this is updated. That's better. Okay. Hmm. Weird. Okay. But Goodman formed overrode CIA heads William Casey and Robert Gates overrode the views of CIA professionals and falsified evidence to support a Soviet linkage. The Times was not alone in following a misleading party line, but it is notable that this paper of record has yet to acknowledge its exceptional gullibility and propaganda service. Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Vietnam. Was the United States a victim or an aggressor? In chapters 5 through 7, we show that the media coverage of the Indochina wars fits the propaganda model very well. The United States first intervened in Indochina immediately after World War II in support of French recolonization, after after which it carried out a 21-year effort, 1954 to 75, to impose a government in the southern half of Vietnam that U.S. officials and analysts consistently recognized as lacking any substantial indigenous support, and in opposition to local nationalist, though communist, forces that were understood to have a mass base. U.S. leaders operated on the belief that their overwhelming military might would not only enable them, but entitle them to force submission to a minority government of U.S. choice. By normal word usage, this would make the U.S. effort in Vietnam a case of aggression. The mainstream media, however, rarely, if ever, found U.S. policy there to be other than highly moral and well intentioned, even if based on miscalculation of its cost to us. See Chapter 5. The media readily accepted that we were protecting South Vietnam, a U.S. creation ruled by a dictator imported directly from the United States, against somebody else's aggression, vacillating in their identification of the aggressor between North Vietnam, the Soviet Union, China, or the resistance in South Vietnam engaging in internal aggression. It is compelling evidence of the propaganda service of the mainstream media that throughout the war they accepted this basic propaganda assumption of the war managers, and from that era up to today, we have never found a mainstream editorial or news report that characterized the U.S. war against Vietnam and then all of Indochina as a case of aggression. After the United States terminated the military phase of the war in 1975, it maintained and enforced an 18-year boycott of the country that it had virtually destroyed. According to Vietnamese estimates, the war had cost them 3 million killed, 300,000 missing, 4.4 million wounded, and 2 million harmed by toxic chemicals. And its land was left ravaged by bombs and Rome plows as well as chemical weapons. With 58,000 killed, the U.S. death toll from the war was under 0.1% of its population. Vietnam's death toll was 17% of its population, and only Vietnam's people were attacked by chemical warfare and had their countryside devastated. Nevertheless, U.S. officials and the mainstream media continued to view the U.S. role in the war as creditable, the United States as the victim. President George Bush stated in 1992 that Hanoi knows today that we seek only answers without the threat of retribution for the past. That is, the Vietnamese have done things to us that might justify retribution on our part, but we only seek answers regarding our men missing in action. New York Times foreign affairs commentator Leslie Gerb justified classing Vietnam an outlaw on the grounds that they had killed Americans. This reflects the common establishment view implicit in Bush's comment that nobody has a right to self-defense against this country, even if it intervenes across the ocean to impose by force a government that the people of that country reject. U.S. chemical warfare in Indochina. It is also of interest how the media have treated the massive use of chemicals during the Vietnam War and the horrifying aftermath of the Let me change this view, actually. Yeah, let's do that. And the massive use of chemicals during the Vietnam War and the horrifying aftermath of the victim country. In 1961 and 62, the Kennedy administration authorized the use of chemicals to destroy rice crops in South Vietnam, in violation of a U.S. tradition as well as international law. Admiral William Leahy, in response to a proposal to destroy Japanese rice crops in 1944, stated that this would violate every Christian ethic I have heard of and all known laws of war. Between 1961 and 1971, however, the U.S. Air Force sprayed 20 million gallons of concentrated arsenic-based and dioxin-laden herbicides, mainly Agent Orange, on 6 million acres of crops and trees, besides using large quantities of the super tear gas CS and vast amounts of napalm and phosphorus bombs. An estimated 13% of South Vietnam's land was subjected to chemical attacks. This included 30% of its rubber plantations and 36% of its mangrove forests, along with other large forest areas destroyed by toxic chemicals in programs that included multiple large scale intentional efforts combining defoliation with incendiaries to produce a forest fire in South Vietnam. A 1967 study prepared by the head of the agronomy section of the Japanese Science Council concluded that U.S. anti crop warfare had already ruined more than 3.8 million acres of arable land in South Vietnam, killing almost 1,000 peasants and over 13,000 livestock. This policy of attempting to force enemy capitulation by destroying its food supply was not only contrary to the rules of war, it was notable that it first and overwhelmingly affected small children. Laos was also subjected to chemical attacks in 1966 and 1969, directed at both crops and vegetation along communication routes. And in Cambodia, some 137 acres of rubber plantations, crops, and forests were heavily sprayed with Agent Orange in the spring of 1969. The Cambodian government complained bitterly at the violation of its neutrality by this inhumane and illegal action, but Cambodia was too small and weak for its voice to be heard or for it to be able to mobilize a legal or other defense. Although the UN General Assembly did strongly condemn the use of chemical agents as contrary to international law, hmm, Cambodia, although the UN international law did strongly condemn the use of chemical agents as contrary to international law by an 83 to 3 vote in 1969, it was powerless to act against the United States, and there was no international community mobilization to halt its use of chemical warfare in Cambodia or elsewhere in Indochina. During the Vietnam War, the use of chemicals was reported and criticized in the U.S. media when first disclosed in 1966, but the subject was quickly dropped. The illegality of chemical warfare and a policy of starvation and their effects on the victim population were virtually unreported. There were exceptions, such as Orville Schell Jr.'s 1971 Look magazine article, Silent Vietnam: How We Invented Ecocide and Killed the Country, but they were rare indeed. After the war, because of the effects of Agent Orange on U.S. soldiers, there was some coverage of this chemical warfare campaign, but the vastly greater impact on the direct targets of this warfare in South Vietnam remained close to invisible. Of 522 articles in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Newsweek, and Time during the 1990s that mentioned Agent Orange and Vietnam together, the vast majority focused on the harm done to U.S. service personnel. Only 9 articles acknowledged the targeting of food crops. 39 mentioned forest cover alone as the target. Only 11 discussed in any details the impact on Vietnamese and the Vietnamese environment. Only 3 detailed the use of Agent Orange as a chemical weapon or chemical warfare, and in only 2 articles was it suggested that its use might constitute a war crime. The Wall Street Journal did have a lead story on this topic in February 1997, reporting that as many as 500,000 children may have been born with dioxin related deformities and that birth defects in the South were 4 times those in the North. The article did acknowledge U.S. responsibility for this disaster, but contended that the United States, emotionally spent after losing the war, paid no heed. But the United States did pay heed for the flight of the boat people, but was not too exhausted to enforce a vigorous boycott of the target of its aggression, even if it took no responsibility whatsoever for the condition of its victims. The large scale application of chemical weapons and napalm in Vietnam was confined to the South. One reason for this was that North Vietnam had a government with links to other countries, so that the use of these barbarous and illegal weapons against it would have been widely publicized. South Vietnam was occupied by the United States and its client regime, so that the victimized people of the South were voiceless and could be treated with unlimited savagery. This, of course, contradicted the claim that we were protecting them against aggression, but the media did not only underplay the savagery, they failed to call attention to the contradiction and its significance. New York Times journalist Barbara Crossett did report that the U.S. failure to get involved in studying the effects of chemical warfare in Vietnam had been unfortunate, because as this country had used it heavily in the South but not in the North, this made Vietnam a controlled experiment in the effects of dioxin on humans from which much could be learned of benefit to ourselves. But neither Crossett nor any other mainstream reporter had anything to say about the fact that the United States had used dioxin only on the ones it was allegedly protecting against aggression, nor did they suggest that this constituted a serious war crime, or that this country might have an obligation to help those it had victimized. During the 1980s, the Reagan administration mounted a major propaganda campaign over alleged victims of yellow rain in Cambodia and Laos, claiming that chemical warfare had been employed there by the Soviet Union through its Vietnam proxy. This propaganda effort eventually collapsed following the U.S. Army's own inability to confirm this warfare, and more importantly, the finding that the alleged yellow rain was bee feces, not chemicals. Nevertheless, this campaign received vastly more publicity than the real and large scale chemical warfare carried out by the United States in Indochina. The Wall Street Journal, which had heavily featured yellow rain and expressed the greatest indignation at this display of communist evil, never mentioned the U.S. employment of chemicals in that area during its Yellow Rain campaign. The journal's publisher, Peter Kahn, eventually wrote that the Vietnam War record had clarified who were the good guys and who were the bad guys, definitively shown by the poison fields of Laos, his euphemism for yellow rain. In short, Kahn places the massive real world use of chemical warfare by the United States in Orwell's Black Hole and demonstrates communist evil by purring forward the discredited claim of yellow rain that his paper has still not admitted to be fraudulent. But the more important facts are these: that with the help of the media, the Soviet Union was effectively linked to the use of this ugly weapon based on false evidence, while by treating the real and large scale use of chemical weapons in Indochina by the United States in very low key up to this very day, the media have helped convey the impression that this country is a moral force on this issue and opposes use of this terrible weaponry. U.S. leaders have opposed the use of chemical warfare by enemy states, but it is a different matter when they choose to use such weaponry themselves, or when a client state does the same. Rewriting Vietnam War history. There have been thousands of books written on the Vietnam War, and that war has been a brooding omnipresence in the U.S. culture since its end in 1975. For the dominant elite, the war represents an era in which resistance to national policy and the associated rise of formerly apathetic sectors of society caused a crisis of democracy. Those unruly sectors and the dissidents are seen as having damaged the cultural and political frameworks and imposed unreasonable impediments to the use of force. The, laner, the latter referred to as the Vietnam Syndrome. Within the unruly sectors and among the dissidents, of course, the 60s the viewed as an era of liberation, of cultural and moral advance, and of temporary surge of democratization. The propaganda model would lead us to expect mainstream media retrospectives on the war to reflect elite perspectives, portraying the 1960s as a dark age and the U.S. role in the war as, at worst, a case of good intentions gone awry. Focusing here on their treatment of the war over the past decade, we see that the media have mainly repeated and elaborated several apologetic themes already entrenched by the end of the war. One theme has been that the U.S. intervention was justified by the fact of communism on the march. It was argued from the beginning that the communist advance in Vietnam was part of a global communist conspiracy, a position maintained in the face of the split and hostility between China and the Soviet Union, tension between China and North Vietnam, and the absence of any evidence that North Vietnam was anybody's tool. In his book, In Retrospect, former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara admits that he and his colleagues made a serious error on this point, but neither he nor the other establishment figures who have used this argument have ever questioned the U.S. right to intervene by force to stop the march of communism in a country where the communists had led a nationalist revolution, were recognized by all official and non official authorities to command the support of a large majority of the population, and where their defeat would require open aggression, mass killing, and the virtual destruction of a distant society. Closely related was the theme that we were protecting South Vietnam and the South Vietnamese, who let the Americans take over the fighting. Editorial of Washington Post, April 30th, 1995. A sub theme of this line is that we let down the South Vietnamese. But as noted earlier, South Vietnam as a political entity was a U.S. concoction, and the U.S. war managers recognized that most of the southern population supported the side the United States was fighting. This explains why the main thrust of U.S. violence was directed to the South, where napalm, B 52 bombing raids, chemical warfare, the institutionalized killing of civilians, and a scorched earth policy were used to destroy the base of the popular movement. We also noted earlier that this ferocious U.S. assault on the South, which contradicted the claim that we were protecting South Vietnamese, remains invisible in the U.S. media. Another important theme in the mainstream media for many years has been the notion that the United States was the victim in the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese the cruel villains. This remarkable inversion of reality has been accomplished by two processes. First, by a massive suppression of evidence on the consequences of the war for the Vietnamese, and second, by demonizing the victims based in large measure on the beatification, beautif- national beatification of prisoners of war and the myth of prisoners of war and martyrs still being tortured by Vietnam. The only Vietnamese allowed modest attention in the media have been those mobilized to fight the U.S. war and who were let down. The vast numbers killed or damaged by the U.S. assault have been treated as unworthy victims. The overwhelming preoccupation of officials, journalists, pundits, and intellectuals with media outreach has been on U.S. victims and the effects of the war on this country. Robert McNamara's widely publicized books, supposedly a mea culpa and moral tract, is notable for the fact that his notion of the war's high costs and the error and guilt that he feels extend only to the U.S. lives and the effects of the war on the political unity of our society. He offers neither regrets, moral reflections, nor apologies for his country having invaded, mercilessly bombed, ravaged the land, and killed and wounded millions of innocent people in a small, distant peasant society in pursuit of its own political ends. In a remarkable cultural process, also, the victims have been turned into the villains. As we describe in Chapter 5, in an attempt to prolong the war, President Richard Nixon seized on the question of the adequacy of Vietnamese accounting for our military personnel who were captured and those missing in action. He succeeded in keeping the war going, and some 16,000 more U.S. soldiers and untold numbers of Vietnamese died in the further fighting in the purported interests of missing POWs. But although there had never been any credible evidence that a single POW was hidden by the North Vietnamese, this claim became an article of faith and cult that dominated U.S. policy towards Vietnam for many years. The myth became the basis of popular cultural accounts in movies such as The Deer Hunter, Uncommon Valor, ROW, The Escape, and Missing in Action, in which Rambo-like heroes slaughter evil Vietnamese as they save our betrayed and tormented POWs. These movies turned history on its head. As Vietnam War historian H. Bruce Franklin points out, America's vision of the war was being transformed. The actual photographs and TV footage of massacred villagers, napalm children, Vietnamese prisoners being tortured and murdered, wounded GIs screaming in agony, and body bags being loaded by the dozens for shipment back home were being replaced by simulated images of American POWs in the savage hands of Asian communists. The powerful cultural myth of abused POWs as the central feature of the Vietnam War not only allowed the war to be extended, it helped justify the U.S. failure to aid its victim in accord with end of war promises, and it provided the basis for an 18-year economic war against the victim country. It also functioned as a potent agent of militarization and force weakening the Vietnam Syndrome. In his recent book, Vietnam and Other American Fantasies, H. Bruce Franklin, who had previously exposed the fallacies and cult qualities of the POW MIA myth, addressed this issue once again, as well as other fantasies, such as the claim that the anti war activists often spit at returning veterans. Franklin's book was reviewed in the Los Angeles Times, but was otherwise only twice mentioned in passing in the U.S. mainstream press. On the other hand, a book by Michael Lind, Vietnam, The Necessary War, which explains that the war was justifiable because communism was on the march, U.S. credibility was at stake, and the Vietnamese communists were cruel and ruthless, demonstrated in part by their refusal to surrender and consequent responsibility for those killed by the U.S. bombs, was treated differently. It received 44 reviews and was mentioned 27 other times in the mainstream media, and Linda was given op ed space in both the New York Times and the Washington Post, among other opportunities. In his review of Lynn's books, Vietnam War historian Uoy Gardner noted that any U.S. credibility problem that arose in connection with the Vietnam War was a creation of the war managers themselves and flowed from their own decisions. And Gardner also comments after analyzing a series of Lind arguments in defense of the war, that the evidence simply washes away his positions like a sandcastle on the beach. But Lind was saying that what what the elite wants said, and Franklin was not, so that mainstream media treatment followed accordingly. Laos. Laos's Plain of Jars was subjected to some of the heaviest bombings of civilian targets in history, especially after 1968, when Washington was compelled under domestic pressure to enter negotiations with North Vietnam and had to terminate its bombing there. It turned to Laos, although that small pheasant country was a marginal factor in the wars, but Nixon and Kissinger could hardly leave U.S. bombers inactive. Overall, some 2 million tons of bombs were dropped on Laos. Those raids wiped out 353 villagers and killed thousands of civilians, and they continue to kill now, as the plain was saturated with hundreds of millions of bombies, tiny anti-personnel weapons specifically designed to kill and maim. With their 20 to 30% failure to explode rate, they remained as potential killers, and their casualty rate is still high, estimates running from hundreds to 20,000 or more per year, half of them deaths, and half the victims children. There have been efforts to deal with this humanitarian catastrophe. The British based Mines Advisory Group has been trying to remove the lethal objects, but the British press reports that the United States is conspicuously missing from the handful of Western organizations that have followed MAG, though it has finally agreed to train some Laotian civilians. The British press also reports with some annoyance that the United States has refused to provide MAG specialists with render harmless procedures, still treated as a state secret for weapons 3 decades old. The U.S. mainstream media have treated in very low key the continuing human toll suffered in Laos and have maintained almost complete silence concerning the U.S. non cooperatives in attempts to alleviate a crisis dating back to the secret war against Laos, which again was secret only by tacit propaganda service of the mainstream media. See Chapter 6. Wow, a lot of stuff here. All right, let's pause here at Cambodia and pick it up tomorrow. Um, Vietnam. Damn, we just went over there and just killed millions of people. Good night.